Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Oakwood Cemetery. We are here to do our, if I count them right, our 7th virtual tour of Oakwood. If you were with us for number 6, you remember that was about crime as represented by people here in Oakwood, everyone from police to perps. Now we're going to take a 180-degree turn, and today we're going to focus on churches, particularly our earliest churches in Raleigh. And I want to extend a thanks to Reverend David Mallory for, in a conversation, suggesting this idea. David does many services out here at Oakwood, and he is the former pastor at the Hillyer Church down on Hillsborough Street in St. Mary's. It so happens that the Hillyers are here with us in Oakwood. Edgar and his wife Augusta were the founders of the church, very dedicated to it. In fact, Edgar Hillyer died at the communion table at the church. Hillyer Church was founded in 1915, and that's a little newer, a little more recent than our theme today. We want to focus, and in fact only have time, to focus on the churches downtown, the very early ones, particularly those that were active at the time of and with the founding of Oakwood Cemetery. So, and we're going to start out with Christ Church. So if you'll come with us, we pull up our socks, and off we go. My name's Bruce Miller, by the way. Your cinematographer, I think we call her, is Robin Simonton. Her day job, the executive director of Oakwood Cemetery. Come with us. All right. Well, let's get started. Now, what we want to do is to talk to you about many of our historic churches downtown. And with that in mind, what we'll do is tell you a little bit about each church that we cover, and then we simply don't have time to do much more than that, along with what we call a representative person for that church. It could be a pastor, or it could be a member of the congregation, someone who in a way represents the spirit of that church, who's here in Oakwood. We're going to start with Christ Church downtown, a congregation founded in 1821, the building on Capitol Square, 1854, with the bell tower, finished just before the war in 1859. Very important to the founding of Oakwood Cemetery. In fact, the 3 men who are credited with being the founders, that is William Anderson and George Mordecai and Mr. Battle, were all members of Christ Episcopal Church. But they proposed the idea. I think it's fair to say that Christ Church proposes the idea of a new cemetery, which instantly became ecumenical. That is, the churches downtown realized that with the city cemetery filling up, with there no room around their church buildings for a dedicated cemetery, they needed a new one. And the proposal of these 3 men, I think, struck a chord with many churches in downtown that we're going to talk about today. And the representative of Christ Church is not one of those 3. We talk about those folks so often. We thought we would go with someone a little more recent, and that was a longtime rector of Christ Church. In fact, over 35 years. His name, Bruce Daniel Sapp, here in the new section of Oakwood. Robin's going to pan around. His marker here in the new section, along with his wife next to him. A very modest one, as you can see. He was from Pamlico County down east. It's always struck me about Dan Sapp, a man whom I knew. In fact, he married my wife and me. Very modest, very gentle fellow, good sense of humor. It always struck me as surprising that during the Second World War he should have been a bombardier with the U.S. Army Air Force. Not in keeping with his character as we knew him. He also was an advertising man for the N&O. Again, that's not the Dan Sapp that we knew. So he has an interesting background. but did a wonderful job leading Christ Church through a very tumultuous time. that is socially, if you will, the rise of women through the ranks of the church and into public life, the whole integration issue, AIDS, along with expanding the church building itself, all fell to Dan Sapp over the years. One very quick anecdote. He was an artist himself. He painted a picture of a wonderful little picture of young girls dressed as angels on the stairway going up into the stairway into one of the church buildings, and it struck the church as such a nice painting. They wanted to turn it into a Christmas card, use it for fundraising, and they wanted to call it Angels in Waiting. However, Dan Sapp, remembering the noise that the little kids always made around the church, wanted to call it Angels We Have Heard on High. But the church got its way, and the card went out as Angels in Waiting. But again, I think reflective of Dan Sapp and his very gentle, dedicated ways. All right, as we go back from the new section back into the historic section, I'm reminded, I should remind you, many of you, that 3 churches have purchased tracts here in Oakwood and use it for members of their congregations. We're right now in the Moravian section. You can see the archway behind me. But the Greek Orthodox Church has done it, I believe, twice. I think is that not right, Robin?
Mm-hmm,
two sections to the Greek Orthodox. And of course, the Hebrew section has been with us from the very beginning. So we have those churches. They have representative churches downtown. Most of them, I think, suburban, and they won't be among the churches that we cover today. But just realize they're hardly forgotten here in Oakwood. A very, very large number of their church members are here with us. All right, the next church that we'll mention is First Baptist Church, another church of tremendous importance, not just to the founding of Oakwood, but to Oakwood through the years. The church building, of course, that you're familiar with on Salisbury Street, sits looking straight across Capitol Square at Christ Church. That church was erected in 1859, but the church itself is much older than that, founded in Raleigh in 1812, 1813, and we'll say more about that in a little while. But our representative figure, there could be countless. This is the gravesite for the family of Jonathan McGee Heck. You know his house on Blunt Street. They've been working on it for years, it seems now, in the 300 block. And Jonathan McGee Heck, very important to the founding of the cemetery as well as business in Raleigh. But we've chosen instead to use this as a representative figure, his daughter, Fannie E. Scudder Heck. And in fact, if you've been by the Heck house, you know that it's Fannie who has the historic marker there, and not her father, the industrialist, land speculator, J.M. Heck. Now Fannie, very, very active in the church. She never married, but devoted all of her energies to the church, particularly the Women's Missionary Union, the WMU, not just here in Raleigh, not just in North Carolina, but in the Southeast. And in fact, Fannie has a church named for her in Louisville, Kentucky, a seminary there. Of course, the anecdote about Fannie E. Scudder Heck. Colonel Heck sent his family to North Carolina during the Civil War. They were originally in Virginia, actually West Virginia, and he sent his family for safety reasons into North Carolina, and that's where Fannie was born. In fact, as of yesterday, 105 years ago, born in North Carolina, thus the E in her name, far from home, Fannie Exile Scudder Heck, a name that never appealed to her. In fact, on all 3 of her markers, right where Robin and I are standing, this one which won't take well in the sun, on the family stone here, and down here on this plaque, which recognizes her work with the WMU, you just see E. In fact, Scudder is a name that she picked, an old family name that she picked to replace Exile, so you rarely see Exile written out anywhere that her name appears, which in terms of the church is in a lot of places for all that she did. Fannie Exile Scudder Heck. All right, we've come across the cemetery. We've moved to the Beechwood section, but we're still symbolically on Capitol Square. This is the third big church on Capitol Square, this in the southwest corner, and of course that's First Presbyterian Church, another church very important to the history of the city and to the history of this cemetery. Founded in 1816, I believe, the congregation. The church that's there now was built in, dedicated anyway, in 1900. But before that, the church for the First Presbyterian Church building was one of the earliest brick buildings, if not the first brick building in downtown Raleigh. Anyway, a long history of this church, many well-known pastors through it. Dr. McFeeters, who's buried in City Cemetery. Dr. Drury Lacey was the preacher at First Pres. He's buried in Oakwood now. He left Raleigh to become the president of Davidson College. William G. Enlow was a congregant at First Presbyterian. The Bates, you remember the Bates sisters, Mamie and Grace, they were members. So again, a very important congregation to the city and to Oakwood. Now in 1907, a new pastor came to what was then a nice new church for him, and that was William McClanahan White. And he himself made his own history for the church. He built the church not with bricks and mortar. That was been done 7 years before. He built the church in terms of its membership, not just in Raleigh, but throughout Wake County. The whole, one might say, central North Carolina did a wonderful job building Presbyterian Church. In fact, in ways that perhaps not even he could have imagined. And for that, we're going to go to another part of the cemetery for our representative Presbyterian. All right, to pursue William McClanahan White's legacy, we've come to the A section. He was in a way sort of like the rock in the pond where the rings go out further and further, and I think in this way, one he might not ever have imagined. He had a daughter named Mary Lawrence White, and she married a fellow named Carl Hudson, a name a lot of you know. He had come to Raleigh at the turn of the last century, after the turn of the last century, and began a department store which became Hudson Belk, downtown first and then out to the shopping malls and so forth. But when Carl Hudson married Mary White, it introduced him to the teachings and preachings of William McClanahan White. And he was so impressed with that, became so impressed, that he promoted and led the drive to begin a church in Mary's father's honor, which became White Memorial Presbyterian Church in North Raleigh, and so impressed were the Presbyterians with Carl Hudson's work that when they started a new congregation, a new church out off of Six Forks Road, they named it Hudson Memorial Church. So again, you see the spreading influence of William McClanahan White that he might not have anticipated. All right, we're up on Chapel Circle now to talk about an odd and important trend that happened after the Civil War. Of course, it was a time of great tumult throughout the nation, and it affected the churches too. At least 3 downtown churches were the results of what I call spin-offs, for lack of a better term. That is a movement for some of the congregation away from the main church and the creation of other churches as a result. I think the most dramatic of those was First Baptist. We've talked about First Baptist and Fannie and so forth. And after the war in 1868, the African Americans who had been members of the up to then integrated church decided that they wanted their own congregation, but they wanted to maintain with their own new congregation the name First Baptist. Why? Because when the church was founded in 1812, 1813, African Americans were just as many, if not more, as a part of that initial group as the whites. So they wanted to keep First Baptist's name, so when they started their new church in 1868 at the southeast corner of Capitol Square on Wilmington Street, it became known as First Baptist Church, Wilmington Street, or for a time it was called First Colored Baptist Church to distinguish it from First Baptist Church on Salisbury Street. Now that wasn't the only church to experience that, because Christ Church did too. The black members of Christ Episcopal Church decided they wanted their own congregation, and they got one. But it became less dramatic than the First Baptist Church because, I think in part, their new church wasn't on Capitol Square. There were no corners left, in fact. That became known as St. Ambrose Church, and it included blacks from what had been integrated Christ Church before the war, as well as at least 10 to a dozen whites who left Christ Church and also joined what became known as St. Ambrose Church. And the original church was at Lane and Dawson Street, later moved down, I believe, to Cabarrus Street, and eventually out of town, still going strong as far as I know, south of Raleigh, St. Ambrose. And the driving force behind it, at least one of the leaders who helped to guide it, was a man you've already met in other contexts here, and that's where we are. This is the grave of J. Brinton Smith. Now, you've known him as the founder of St. Augustine's, as the superintendent of Oakwood Cemetery, and a man who died a rather horrific death, but now you know him as a churchman. The DD behind his name finally takes more meaning, Doctor of Divinity, long-time Episcopal churchman, and it was he who, I hesitate to say led, he was certainly a part of the break from Christ Church to the creation of St. Ambrose Church. Of course, St. Augustine's University has its own chapel built long after Smith passed away. It's a very handsome chapel on the grounds of St. Augustine's. And I think the new school, St. Aug's, and St. Ambrose worked together, perhaps they still do, over the years. Now the third spin-off we don't usually place in the same context as the ones we've just talked about, but we've come to Beechwood section to discuss what was in fact another spin-off, this one a little later, in 1874, when a group, again Christ Church involved, but a group left Christ Church and founded the Church of the Good Shepherd. The original church on Hillsborough Street, Hillsborough and McDowell, now stands just a couple of blocks south of where Robin and I are now. It was moved. The stone church that's there now finished finally in 1914 under the leadership of Reverend Pittenger. And we're at his grave now, not as a representative, though he's a wonderful representative of the church, but we wanted to present another one to you too. But we often stop at Pittenger's stone. Why? Because it's unique as far as we know to Oakwood. Why? As Robin pans down, you'll see the sun in an awkward position for her. He has the dates that he lived, the years that he lived, but he also has the number of days. And I don't know about you, but when I see that, it makes me far more conscious of the ephemeral nature of all of our lives than the dash between the two years that tell the bookends of our existence. 29,212 days he lived. It always makes me want to stop and count my own, but I don't have the patience to do it. Anyway, we want to go now, come with us over to the Polk section, because we're going to tell you another Good Shepherd story involving a grave that isn't a grave. Come with us. All right, we're still talking about the Church of the Good Shepherd, but we've moved to the Polk section of the cemetery. I should have mentioned earlier that one of the reasons for the split, and you heard this on one of our earlier talks, was that Christ Church continued to charge for its pews. And a lot of people didn't take well to that. It smacked of exclusivity to many. And so they split and created a free church. The Church of the Good Shepherd was a free church. Now, I should say in Christ Church's defense, it wasn't the only church that charged for pews. In fact, I think the Presbyterian Church charge for pews for a time, but keep in mind that was a way for the church to raise money, to raise funds, at a time when there weren't many ways for the church to raise funds. I'll tell you what, we're going to stop for a moment so you can hear and try and do something with our mowers. Hang on, don't go away. If you'll excuse us for that little interlude, this is a working place, and the mowers are out here doing their job. Now if we can just talk that cicada into being quiet, you'll be able to hear me. Again, I was talking about the fees for pews. Not popular with anybody, really, I suppose, but I suspect they sustained a lot of congregations. Anyway, we're at the gravesite that's not a gravesite. It is. Some of the grave spaces have been sold off, but by and large it's still empty and nice, very attractive site, raised property, nice green grass. This was the gravesite of one Theodore Lyman. Theodore Lyman was an Episcopal bishop. He was an Episcopal bishop for a little over 10 years. He died in 1893 and was buried here. But the Church of the Good Shepherd had him disinterred and transferred and buried in the basement of the Church of the Good Shepherd, where he is to this day. Now, you may think that's rather crude, but not really. If you see the gravesite, it's as though they took a gravesite from out here in the open with the stone, with the iron fence, and moved it into the basement of Church of the Good Shepherd. It's got a few more pipes and wiring around it that you wouldn't find in the cemetery, but other than that, it's an intact gravesite. Church of the Good Shepherd has its bishop beneath the altar, so to speak, just as Christ Church long had its bishop, Bishop Ravenscroft, beneath its altar. All right, Robin and I have come all the way across the cemetery to talk about another grand old church, if I can use that phrase, downtown, very important to the history of the city of Raleigh as well as the cemetery, and that of course is the Edenton Street United Methodist Church. Founded as a congregation in 1807, and it's been through, the building that's there now, huge church, has been there, is the fourth church. I think the first large church there, and I may be wrong, but I think the first large church there was the third one, which was dedicated in 1887. Now, a name you've heard us mention a great deal in Oakwood was involved in that, and that was Stanhope Pullen, who joined the Methodist Church late in life, and when he saw the need that the church had for funding to build that new church, including its huge tall steeple, he pitched in. That was the way Pullen worked. If you asked him for a contribution, you wouldn't get it, but he would stand on the side and watch. But there's a story there, because in 1956, lightning hit that steeple and burned the church to the ground. And the firemen who came out to fight that fire knew they couldn't save the church. The steeple was in flames. My goodness, the newspaper had dramatic photos, as you might imagine. In the NNO, Josephus Daniels was a member. This huge fire brought the church to the ground, and the firemen recognized they couldn't save it, but they could save the building next to it. That was the Sunday school. That building was built in 1937, and the person who built it, we're at his mausoleum right now. That was Dabney T. Poindexter, a Virginian who came to Raleigh and began the Capital City Bottling Company. I think they bottled Coca-Cola. I can't swear to that. But he did very well in business, and he, in 1937, dedicated the Sunday school building to his wife. And to this day, you see Poindexter engraved over the door. He supervised the building of it apparently very closely. He would go around and sit in the chairs to make sure that they'd be comfortable for everybody. But he stayed in the background, and in a way, even though I don't know a great deal about Dabney Poindexter, he sounds like a Pullen kind of guy. That is, wealthy, but in the background, hardly a church activist. But when he saw that the church could use a facility, he was there to provide it, very modest, and to be very modest about it. Dabney Poindexter, a good representative, we think, of Edenton Street Memorial Church. The church, by the way, to replace, that's there now, replaced the church that burned down in 1956 within just a few years, and that is the fourth church in the Grand Church in downtown Raleigh. Right, we've come to the green burial ground, Mordecai Meadow, to sort of close the circle on Raleigh churches. And in this case, we're going to have a representative of Sacred Heart Church downtown on Hillsborough Street, diagonally across from Church of the Good Shepherd. The congregation, founded in the 1870s, small one, not many Catholics in Raleigh in those days. And the church built in the 1920s, I want to say 1924, I'm not exactly sure of that, but again, a small Catholic church, but it happened to be the seat of the bishop of the diocese, that is, in Latin, the cathedra, the seat of the bishop, which made Sacred Heart a cathedral, and the smallest cathedral in the lower 48 states. Of course, now it's been replaced with something we envision as a cathedral out in West Raleigh now. But Sacred Heart has a proud history, and the representative that we've chosen is one who's very loyal to the church. He was a church member on many committees out there, served the church well, and that would be Carl Edward Larson, who is buried here in the green section. So I was going to pan in on his grave there. He was a graphic designer for NC State. That was his vocation, but his love was Raleigh itself. And much like Fred Olds, whom you met earlier in one of our presentations, he wanted other people to appreciate Raleigh as he did, Raleigh's history in particular. Now, whereas Fred Olds worked with school children, hundreds of thousands, quite literally, that wasn't exactly Carl Larson's realm. He was a graphic designer by his profession, and he did a lot of his presentation of Raleigh was graphic. In fact, when he retired from his work with the university, he went to work at what must have been for him a wonderful job, a perfect match. Why? This man who loved Raleigh, a man familiar with photography and with graphics. He was with the State Library photographic library, the archival library in the archives building. A wonderful job for a wonderful man. Why do we pick him? Because of his close ties to Oakwood Cemetery, personally and professionally. He was consulted at various restoration work that went on around the cemetery. Sometimes he agreed, and he'd let you know if he didn't. In fact, you can see that on his stone. I don't know about that. It was a common expression of his if he wasn't in accord with the view on the history of a place. And he also was a blogger, a wonderful blog called Goodnight Raleigh. You can still get to it. It's still online. And it covered all sorts of disparate topics about Raleigh. It might be a house, it might be anything, an event, generally architecture. Perhaps you sat in on his the show, I remember in particular, that he gave on old Victorian houses in Raleigh. Raleigh used to be full of them. It's not anymore. You had to have people like Carl Larson who would remind us of that. Again, a very close friend of Oakwood Cemetery, personally and professionally. So we thought that would be an appropriate way to end our talk on churches. Thanks for being with us.